Well, greetings everyone. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. I thought long and hard about whether I wanted to do a video in response to these two YouTubers because typically I try to keep responses geared towards those people who I've had a debate with. But in this case, I actually had some people send these to me and say, hey, really would like to hear your thoughts on this. And I also think it can be educational for our students and for people that might listen. So I'm gonna go through some of what they say, not all of it. Altogether, the videos are like, I don't know, 2.5 hours long. So we're not going to go through all of everything in both videos. But I want you to notice three things as we take a look at this. First of all, I want you to notice that there are two very different approaches to YouTube atheism represented in these two videos. The first guy that we're going to look at, Godless Engineer, it's interesting. They all kind of go by these like superhero type names in this underground rap battle debate world between Christians and atheists that I've noticed. It's not just the atheists. Christians do it too. It's interesting. I guess it's kind of fun. But the first guy we're going to look at is more of a kind of in-your-face, kind of loud, bombastic, overblown, misplaced confidence type of thing, where it's kind of, how could you ever believe this? And it's a lot of loud, in-your-face, Michael Bay type, approach, kind of a WWF type approach. And there are certain people that is really persuasive with. There are some young guys out there, I think, that really are attracted to this. A lot of language. You'll notice as we go through that I've had to cut out a lot of the language. But there are people that like that over-the-top, bombastic approach. And so we're going to look at that. And then the next guy, the second video that we'll look at, is from a guy calls himself PineCreek, or at least that's the name of his channel. I think his name is Doug. And I've chatted a little bit in text form online with Doug when he's commented on a video that I was where I was doing an interview with someone else. And so we're gonna look at him. Now, he's not this over-the-top, loudmouth, bombastic sort of guy. Instead, he takes a more mature, at least presumably mature, pastoral approach. I'm trying to help you guys see what's wrong with this. I'm trying to help you understand that you really should have more doubt in your life, and that's his approach. He thinks that doubt is a good thing, and so and of course doubt can be a good thing, but that's his whole deal. Is I want to help you guys to understand that you're putting too much confidence in your Christian apologetics, and so he appeals, I think, to another crowd. And I'm not saying there's not overlap, but he appeals to more of the crowd that would like a more measured approach. Now, his approach is subtly condescending, and that has to be noted. But we'll take a look at him as well. They hit on some of the same themes, but they do it from two very different perspectives, or very different, at least in terms of tone. So we're going to take a look at those. And I point that out. I think that's helpful because when young people, and not just young people, hear Christian speakers and thinkers talk about these things, one of the first places they know to go to get answers is to go to YouTube. And I think that's why YouTube attracts a lot of these kind of people. And of course, it attracts me too, because I want to be out there countering this sort of thing. And this is the kind of stuff they'll hear. Gone are the days when you got a response from a Christian philosopher, historian, or New Testament scholar on a live public stage, and then you heard from the atheist philosopher, New Testament scholar, or historian, and both of them were highly credentialed, and they could sit there and talk about all the nuances, and you got kind of your information that way. Those days are gone. That still happens, obviously. I just had a debate with Matt Dillahunty at Baylor University. That is the impetus for all of this. But the fact still remains, the vast majority of what people get now are these online sort of interactions. And so that's good for Christian educators, Christian pastors, ministry people to know, and parents, is that this is what they're getting. So be aware of it, and be aware that there are multiple approaches. So there's not just one brand of YouTube atheist out there. The second thing that I want you to notice as we go through this is I want you to notice the level of mockery that's there. Now, it's more obvious with our first character, but it's there too with Doug from PineCreek as well. It's either an obvious mockery or a subtle mockery that you're going to notice as we go through these. And so it's not that these guys don't ever point to anything that they see as problematic with the evidence. Sometimes they do, but particularly with Doug, we're going to find out he continually just talks about that, I'm not really going to get into the evidence here. I'm not really going to talk about, I'm not really going to criticize this whole case. But it's just this, how could you believe? How is it that in the 21st century we're still believing stuff like this? That sort of thing. And notice that that's not an argument. That is just merely an attempt to instill doubt based on nothing rational, no real evidence-based reasoning. Now, again, I want to be clear because these guys will probably see this and because I want to be open and honest with everyone. They do some of that stuff, but the majority of what we get is this sort of thing, this mockery. And with this mockery that's an attempt to instill doubt, it's kind of like capturing Christianity's Cameron Bertuzzi recently said on a video when he was talking about how questions aren't arguments. So when you ask a question, it may feel like an argument, but it's not an argument. I think that's a really good point. And I think it needs to be said that this mockery and stuff like this, it's kind of like marketing. It's kind of like just an attempt to paint the Christian apologist or thinker in a certain respect and to paint the atheist in a different respect. And so be aware of that. Be aware of when we're actually doing logic, when we're actually looking at evidence, and when we're merely mocking. And lastly, I would want to point to the fact that there is a certain amount of this for that reason that is emotion driven. That is, and we're going to see that especially toward the end of this video, that there is a real attempt to rely on what seems or what feels right, what emotionally seems to be the case, which I think is somewhat counterintuitive when we think about the fact that that's usually what Christian apologists get tagged with. So let's go ahead and begin looking at some of this, and I hope that this will be enjoyable and helpful to you. And we'll take a look first at Godless Engineer. I think you'll enjoy this.
What's up, heathens? How ya doing? Today we're going to be addressing Matt Dillahunty's most recent opponent, Braxton Hunter. In their most recent debate, Braxton comes out with these bedrock facts and this principle of recalibrated plausibility. He's wrong about everything he says, and I hope to show you how religious his position is. If you're interested in this, then please stay tuned. Now, Braxton starts out this debate by laying out his case for the Christian God. And he defines his case as being mostly based on these bedrock facts, which has a few components that catch my eye.
Also, I'd like to say that the majority of my case will be built on what historians call bedrock facts. A bedrock fact is considered as such by historians if it has two things going for it. One, it is highly evidenced, and two, it enjoys the consensus of critical scholarship, and that includes atheists and agnostics and Christians and perhaps others.
So these bedrock facts are not highly evidenced, and the consensus is actually wrong about them, at least the consensus that he brings up.
Okay, now I want you to notice a couple of things. First of all, you see the mockery with the air quotes, bedrock facts, that sort of thing. This is what we're talking about. This is the mockery of the discipline and an attempt to sway people merely with rhetoric. Now, rhetoric can be a good thing. Rhetoric can be important, and there's nothing wrong with it. But if that's all you're bringing to a particular point, then that's not a very strong point. You're just trying to move people purely with emotion or what it feels like. Let's talk about bedrock facts for just a minute. Bedrock facts, that's not Christian language. That's the language that historians use when they look at these things. And as I said in the video, a bedrock fact has to have two things in order to be considered a bedrock fact. It has to be highly evidenced, and it has to enjoy the consensus of critical scholarship. Now, you'll notice that he said the consensus is wrong, at least the consensus that he mentions. Well, what do you mean the consensus that I'm mentioning? I mean the consensus. That is the consensus of all historians who have talked about this or written on this. It's the consensus of critical scholarship, and we're not just talking about Christians. So, and the claim that it's not highly evidenced is just an assertion. It wouldn't be considered a bedrock fact if it wasn't highly evidenced. Now, you may disagree with the way that we're using the evidence, but it's still highly evidenced. So another thing about bedrock facts that I would have liked to have mentioned in the debate is when historians talk about what could be the best explanation for a particular piece of data or a particular set of events, it has to account for certain things that are considered facts. Now, we're not saying that we have like absolute Cartesian certainty about this, but they have to be highly evidenced and the consensus agrees on them. If your hypothesis doesn't account for the bedrock facts, then that hypothesis needs to be ditched, or at least you need to go back and do some more work to show why, first, these bedrock facts shouldn't be considered bedrock facts. You can't just say that they're not bedrock facts. So if, say, Bart Ehrman or Richard Carrier or somebody wants to convince the world and convince the scholars in journal articles and in books that they write of a competing hypothesis for the events surrounding the resurrection, that competing hypothesis needs to deal with those bedrock facts. If it doesn't, it's just not going to get very far. That's why, unfortunately, we don't see a lot of scholarly embrace of, say, Jesus mythicists like this character on the screen, Godless Engineer, who doesn't believe that Jesus ever existed, if I understand him correctly. By the way, if you want to see a great discussion with him on this topic, you should check out the discussion he had with Inspiring Philosophy's Michael Jones, because they had a great discussion about it. And at least according to Michael Jones, everything that Godless Engineer was saying was just pulled from a atheist rational wiki article. And so this speaks to something else. When people go to look for the actual evidence, one of the reasons they might not come to the determination that the bedrock facts are in fact highly evidenced and are bedrock facts and enjoy the consensus, not just a consensus, whatever that's supposed to mean, is because oftentimes when people go to research these things, and it happens on both sides, it's not just atheists, they don't go to the best material on these. What they do is they go to other YouTube atheists or other atheist blog articles or stuff put together by people that are not necessarily credentialed. Now, you don't have to be credentialed to get to the truth, but it is helpful when you, as we're talking about the consensus now, to realize that these people who make up this consensus of scholars are people who have gone to school on this. You know, one of the great things about going to school, especially to get to the doctoral level, is you have to read a lot of stuff that you wouldn't choose to read. And that's one of the great benefits, is when you read things that you wouldn't necessarily choose to read, you come across stuff you wouldn't have discovered on your own, just kind of autodidactically studying and learning these things. And so there may be some minor little point that the author of the book doesn't even spend a lot of time on, and that could be the thing that moves you off of a position. So yeah, it really does matter to get your information from people who really have studied this and devoted their lives to it. That's really, really helpful. I'm not saying it's not important to study people who aren't credentialed and haven't done that. They may have done a lot of study too, but let's not just brush off the consensus here. So let's go on and see what else he has to say.
They paint non-evidence or bad evidence as actual evidence.
Okay. He says they paint non-evidence or bad evidence as actual evidence. Okay, I hope you see the internal contradiction there. If it's bad evidence, it's evidence. What we're getting from Godless Engineer here is that he doesn't agree with how the evidence is used. But that's different from whether or not we have evidence. And by the way, we have really great evidence.
He also heavily bases his entire opening statement here on the fact that this consensus agrees that Jesus was risen from the dead and that the Christian God exists.
Okay, now this sort of a statement is how you know that the person you're talking about, and I really don't want to be unkind. I hope that those of you who follow my ministry and watch these videos know that I try to be really measured and caring and kind, but I have to point to truth when I see it. And when you hear someone say something like this, you know that it's a person who isn't really all that familiar with this field of study. And I know that Godless Engineer has studied a lot of this mythicist stuff, and he's heard what the Christian apologists have to say because he's done videos about it. But here's the thing you need to notice. I don't know of a Christian apologist on the planet, and certainly not any that are well known, who would ever say that the consensus agrees that Jesus rose from the dead and that the Christian God exists. I certainly didn't say that in the debate. In fact, that's precisely the point. The point of pointing to, if they agree that the Christian God exists, they wouldn't be atheist and agnostic critical scholars, would they? No. The reason I pointed out that we have Christian, atheist, agnostic, and perhaps some others is because we want to make the point that these people grant the surrounding pieces of data, that Jesus died, that people had experiences after Jesus' death that they interpreted as appearances of the risen Lord, that they were willing to alter their lives to a drastic degree, and many of them were willing to die for the claim that Jesus had risen from the dead. Those claims have nothing directly to do with, no, I'm not pointing to scholars that are saying that Jesus rose from the dead or the Christian God exists. That would miss the whole point. He said at the beginning of the video, I hope to point out how religious Braxton's position is. It would be very religious and faith-based if that was what I was saying. And perhaps that's the problem. I wouldn't say that. What I'm saying is they point to these surrounding bedrock facts, and that's what they are, sorry, and that lends credibility to the resurrection hypothesis that I and other Christian apologists want to bring. So this is a big misunderstanding, and it reveals the level of understanding that our spokesperson, atheist spokesperson here, has about the material that we're dealing with here. So let's move on. Oh, now, next, what I want to point out is I've put together a bunch of cuts from the video where he's saying again and again and again the same exact thing, namely that we just rely on the consensus of scholars and don't pay attention to the evidence, and that I don't even bring one single piece of evidence in my opening statements. So let's hear that. Now it's a little bit laborious. It won't take long, maybe a minute, but I want you to hear how over and over again he repeats this refrain about the consensus of scholars. You'll be sick of hearing the word consensus after this clip.
Also seem to lean hard on the consensus. Oftentimes, this consensus that the Christian apologists love to use is very vague or doesn't really support their particular position. They present this consensus, but more importantly, they only present the consensus. They do not try to substantiate this consensus with any kind of actual evidence. All he says is, well, N.T. Wright thinks it's ludicrous, therefore it's ludicrous.
Okay, is that true? First of all, N.T. Wright was one of the scholars, but those that saw the debate will note that I mentioned N.T. Wright. Yes, he's a Christian scholar, but I also mentioned Gerd Ludemann, an atheist New Testament atheist New Testament scholar. I also mentioned Giza Vermesh, a Jewish scholar. I also mentioned John Dominic Crossan, a liberal Christian scholar who doesn't believe in a bodily resurrection, and in his debate with William Lane Craig actually accidentally admitted that he's some kind of an atheist. I mentioned Paula Fredrickson, who's a liberal Jewish scholar. So I didn't just mention N.T. Wright, and of course he realizes that. And I wouldn't say just because these guys think this, and gals, that means it's true. But let's continue with the refrain about the consensus.
And don't you dare question, because it's ludicrous to question the consensus. Now, he's going to list off a whole bunch more scholars that agree with his position. Not one single piece of actual evidence. It is a fact that these people think these things. But that is the only evidence that he actually gives. Braxton is only presenting the consensus and no evidence to support this consensus. And it's because he's only providing the consensus as the evidence. So basically what your evidence boils down to is that a bunch of scholars agree that Jesus was crucified on the cross. That's all that you have.
Okay, now notice that's all I have is that Jesus died on the cross. Okay, first of all, those aren't even all of the bedrock facts that I pointed to the scholars to demonstrate. Number one, Jesus died on the cross. Number two, people had experiences after his death that they interpreted as appearances of the risen Christ, and they were willing to die for this claim. Those are. He just points to the crucifixion. I gave three. I actually gave four, but we're going to get to that when we talk about recalibrated plausibility and what he has to say about that. But here's where we get to the big moment. Now, you've heard him repeatedly refrain that all I brought was the consensus. That's all I mentioned. That's the only evidence I had. Not one piece of actual evidence. Then we get this.
Excuse me? What evidence have you actually presented?
Okay, now I want you to notice, and if you're listening to this merely by audio, you might miss this, but I want you to see this. So he's gone on this big tirade about the consensus, and now he comes to the ultimate moment, the climactic moment where he's saying, excuse me. Again, there's that mockery again. That's more of that trying to sway you with mere rhetoric and ultimately emotional appeals based in mockery. But we see here that at this ultimate moment, this climactic moment, when he's saying, I didn't bring one actual piece of evidence. Now notice, this is the moment where he's saying not one piece of actual evidence. And he has, in post-production, put this crawler at the bottom of the screen, or this statement at the bottom of the screen that is very odd. It says, Tacitus doesn't prove Jesus was crucified. At best, he proves that Christians existed in Rome in the 60s. That's all. Okay, that's really interesting. Because for those that don't know, Tacitus was the greatest historian of ancient Rome, and Tacitus talks about Jesus being killed or executed under Pontius Pilate. Now, he's not a Christian, and he's very early. He's a very early source on this. Now, this is very odd because it makes me wonder, why did he feel the need to put this thing on the screen in post-production about Tacitus? After all, if I had mentioned Tacitus in my opening statements, that would have been a piece of actual evidence. And he's repeatedly told us that I didn't bring even one piece of actual evidence. I've only pointed to the scholars. And so if I had mentioned that, then that would have been evidence. If I didn't mention that, then why do you feel the need to put something up here about Tacitus? And this is incredibly telling and makes everything else that he's said so far absolutely negated. The reason he puts Tacitus up here on the screen right now is because I can only suppose that in post-production, in listening back, he realized, oh, wait a minute. Braxton did mention Tacitus in his opening statements. Right at the end of my first point about Jesus' death by crucifixion, I mentioned that the greatest historian of ancient Rome, Cornelius Tacitus, testifies to this and that we have that. So is that one piece of actual evidence? Yes, and actually there's more than that we'll talk about in just a moment. But I did mention Tacitus. That means that rather than his reshooting the video, he couldn't be bothered to reshoot the video and actually say, okay, well, he did mention some evidence. Let me talk about that in a reasonable and measured way. No, instead what we get is, we hear him say not one piece of evidence, and then in post-production, he stuck this statement up here about Tacitus without even mentioning that the reason he's putting it there is because I mentioned that. Why couldn't he say that the reason that he put it up there was because I mentioned it? Because it would have invalidated everything he said, because I actually pointed to a piece of substantial evidence about the resurrection. Now, it is true that I didn't mention much more than that in the point about the crucifixion in my opening statements. I tried to provide one or two pieces of actual supporting evidence in addition to the scholars because this is a debate. Let me tell you how debates work. In debates, you have a limited amount of time. And in this debate, I wasn't just arguing for the resurrection. I was arguing for the existence of the Christian God. That means that I had already presented two arguments for God's existence, which took up about half of my opening statements. So I had only 10 minutes to make an entire case for the resurrection of Jesus, which included my pointing out what I call recalibrated plausibility that we'll talk about in a moment, which most people haven't paid attention to, and I really wanted to do the work to set that up. I still put in evidential pieces and the consensus of scholars and pointed to the quotes from those scholars. Why? Because in a debate, when you have limited time, what you want to do is then in the cross-examinations, you want to go back and you want to actually talk with your opponent about that. So Matt's job is to press me on that evidence. Matt's job is to challenge what I've said. What we heard from Matt was the same thing we heard here from Godless Engineer, which was that I only pointed to the consensus of scholars, which is false. That's why when we got to the cross-examination in the debate, I asked Matt, is it the case that you're not going to present a competing hypothesis for the resurrection? And by that, of course, I mean that's going to deal with these bedrock facts or challenge these bedrock facts or challenge the consensus of scholars. Matt's response was, correct. I'm not going to bring those things. So that was on Matt. And that was a major tell, as I've repeatedly said now in that debate, was that this debate is on the existence of the Christian God, and Matt did not deal with or challenge me directly on the resurrection. The way you challenge someone on that is not just to brush off what they've said by pointing out that they've only mentioned the consensus of scholars, which is, as we can see now, not what I did, but is to actually set up a competing hypothesis. That's how historiography is done. If you don't have a competing hypothesis, if you wish to claim agnosticism on the point, that's fine. You can do that. But if you're going to do that, then why are you at this debate? Because the debate is going to involve you setting up a competing hypothesis for what actually happened, not taking no position or the I don't know position, which we'll come back to later in this video. So we actually did mention evidence here. Now, is this Tacitus thing, is what he says here true? Tacitus doesn't prove Jesus was crucified? Well, it depends on what you mean by prove. I mean, when we're doing history, we don't look for this like Cartesian certainty. Like, can we know this as well as we know our own existence or something? No, but we want to look for what's plausible, what's likely to be true. We have multiple sources, early ancient sources, which mention Jesus from non-Christian sources. And Josephus, for example, mentions the death of Jesus, and people will point out that that's an interpolation, but Josephus scholars believe we can get to the actual original quote without the interpolation, and those are non-Christian Josephus scholars who think so. Likewise with Tacitus, people don't really, listen, it's not really much in question that Tacitus here is talking about Jesus. In fact, Bart Ehrman, no friend of Christianity, says, Tacitus' report confirms what we know from other sources that Jesus was executed by order of the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, sometime during Tiberius' reign. That is from Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium, 2001, page 59. Other people who affirm this, John Dominic Crossan, Gregory Boyd, Paul Eadie, and they believe that this confirms, this statement by Tacitus confirms, we won't say prove, we'll say confirms, what the Bible says, that Jesus died under Pontius Pilate. Paul Eadie points out that Tacitus was known for checking his sources and didn't report gossip. That's my paraphrase of Eadie. But here's the important thing about that. Whenever people like Godless Engineer usually challenge Tacitus, what they'll say is, if they don't argue that it's an interpolation, they'll say, well, Tacitus is just reporting what he got from Christians. That's why Godless Engineer puts here that this just proves that there were Christians in Rome in the 60s. He's saying that Tacitus just heard this from Christians. Well, that's fine unless you know how Tacitus writes. See, this is the thing. You've got to actually read the journal articles, and you've got to actually understand Tacitus and read Tacitus. Now, I'm not saying that Godless Engineer hasn't done that, but if he has, then he should know that Tacitus doesn't report gossip. Like Paul Eadie says, whenever it is that Tacitus is telling you something that's just hearsay, he lets you know that he's telling you something that he just heard from someone else. He doesn't do that in this case. And if in Tacitus' position, he would have possibly had access to filings from Pontius Pilate or about the period or about the event of this crucifixion. And that may be where he got this direct information. We don't know. In fact, there are a couple of scholars who've done a lot of work in that area, Gerd Thiessen and Annette Mers. And so you can research them further if you want to look into that. So all of this just kind of, rests on your understanding of Tacitus. But the point I really want to make here, and the thing I want you to take away from this, is that he has repeatedly said that I brought no evidence, and now in post-production, he has to slide it in there that, oh yeah, Braxton did talk about some evidence. I just forgot to mention that, but I can't be bothered to go back and reshoot the video. So that's an important and telling moment, I think, here. I also mentioned in my next point about those people thinking they had appearances of Jesus after his death, also a bedrock fact that people had experiences that they interpreted as appearances. I mentioned that passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 7, which is understood by scholars to be an early creedal statement in use by the church as early as 5 years or earlier after the events in question. So, and I think, if I don't remember now, but I think in the original video, he actually mentioned something about that. So the point is, that's a piece of evidence that I pointed to as well. So I don't know. I don't know how he could. Honestly, I want to be cool about this. I want to be kind, but I don't know how someone with a straight face could say that I didn't mention these sorts of things. So anyway, I'll just go ahead and move forward with it. We'll see what else he says.
Presented here, Braxton, because I don't think that you have presented any evidence. I also love the recalibrated plausibility principle or whatever here.
Okay, now notice again the mockery. I love this recalibrated plausibility. More of the mockery, more of the rhetoric.
Nevertheless, I'd like to head that off with something that I call recalibrated plausibility. What is recalibrated plausibility? Well, if God did not exist, or if Jesus was just any other first century Jew, then of course the resurrection would be incredibly implausible. But I've given good reason tonight to believe that God does exist, and it is universally accepted, or at least almost universally accepted by scholars, that Jesus thought of himself at the very least as God's special agent to bring about the kingdom on earth. So those two features together give us what I would call recalibrated plausibility.
So basically, let me make sure I get this correct. Basically, you agree that it's highly implausible that this Christ, Messiah, Jesus person rose from the dead. But because you presuppose that God exists and that Jesus thinks of himself as God or an agent of God or something like that, that is what you're actually building your case on?
Okay, so is that correct? Well, now, this is a typical thing that is said among skeptics, and that is that Well, in order to make the case for the resurrection, a lot of these Christian apologists have to just presume that God exists. Now, this betrays a lack of awareness. It makes me wonder if you watched the whole debate, because the first 10 minutes of my opening statements were setting up arguments for God's existence. I gave two, I think, powerful reasons to believe that God does exist, so that when we got to the resurrection, we could make this point. So we could already have God in play as a force that would be able to do something like a resurrection. If God could create the universe from nothing, then raising a man from the dead should be small potatoes for him. All right. So he says, I just have to presume that God exists. No, I'm not presuming that God exists at all. I gave you arguments for God's existence. Now, at this point, if someone wanted to take issue with my resurrection case, that means that they would have to go back and take issue with God's existence, because these things flow together. And we don't get that from Godless Engineer. We don't get him going back and dealing with the free will argument or the Kalam cosmological argument. Nothing like that. Just the mischaracterization that all I did was presume the existence of God. I hope you're seeing here how this rhetoric plays out and how it's not necessarily based on what the evidence actually is. And, it's interesting because he starts out saying that my position is religious. And what we're getting here is rhetoric and mockery and emotion. Not entirely. He said some things, but still, I want to point those things out. He also said, so you telling me that you realize that the resurrection of Jesus is highly implausible? Yes, the resurrection of Jesus, if naturalism is true, if there is no God, is highly implausible, if not impossible, as far as I know. But that's why we argued first for God's existence again, so that we see that naturalism is false, God exists, and now it's not implausible when we put all of these things together. So a simple misunderstanding can throw off your entire criticism of a case. We need to see that.
You even have this analogy to better explain recalibrated plausibility.
And I'll give you an analogy for how that works. Imagine that you encountered a group of people in a coffee shop somewhere who were excitedly telling you how they just saw this guy Neil walking on the moon. Can you believe it? We have video of it. We just saw this guy Neil walking on the moon. Now let's also imagine that you don't know anything about NASA. You don't know anything about the moon landing or space exploration. And so this sounds incredibly implausible. In fact, it's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary claim. But then let's imagine that later you actually do find out about this organization called NASA that has the sufficient power to put a man on the moon. And you also learn that there's this guy named Neil who was in the 1960s claiming to be a part of NASA's program, as if he was saying, just watch my life and see what happens. Now go back to your friends in the coffee shop. Does their claim seem implausible? No, in fact, it seems very plausible. Why? Because we have recalibrated the plausibility for the discussion.
Oh my God.
Okay. More of the mockery. Just want to point that out. Look at his composure. Listen to what he's saying. It's just more of the rhetoric, more of the mockery. And the mockery would be well placed if he was correct in his criticism. Let's hear what his criticism is. Now, let's play a game here and find out. Is this going to be the kind of criticism that we have gotten from others, where it criticizes the analogy and not the point of the analogy? That's a big problem, and it's a real issue when people are not able to criticize the point of an analogy. Obviously, as everyone says, no analogy is perfect, right? All analogies fail at some level because they're not the exact event they're describing, they're analogous. And so we're going to find out whether or not this guy is able to understand the point of the analogy, or is he just going to criticize the analogy itself?
There is a drastic difference between Jesus raising from the dead and Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. We do not have the same kind of evidence that we have for Neil Armstrong walking on the moon as we do for Jesus. And second, no, you shouldn't just believe some random guy walking on the side of the street saying that he walked on the moon. You would need a lot of evidence to suggest that, because there's a low probability that he would have actually walked on the moon. But the difference here is that we actually have the evidence, not through Armstrong himself, like you seem to suggest, but through the massive amount of evidence surrounding the entire Apollo program, including video evidence that he walked on the fucking moon. Now,
Okay, so we see here he's criticizing the analogy and not the point of the analogy. This is what we've been saying all along. I hope this makes sense to you. So the point of the analogy is pretty simple. On the one hand, you have God, who is a sufficient power to raise someone from the dead, just like NASA is a sufficient power to do something like put someone on the moon. That's the parallel there. That's the only parallel there. That's all we're talking about. And we have established that NASA exists in the analogy because our character later finds that out as background information. And with God, we've presented two arguments for God's existence. In the case of God, he's a sufficient power to raise someone from the dead. In the case of NASA, it's someone who has the sufficient power to do something like put someone on the moon. Then the other analogy is with, or the other part of the analogy is with Jesus being like Neil, in that Jesus is walking around saying, watch my life and see what happened. I'm God's special agent to bring about the kingdom. And in other words, I'm a part of God's special program. And then you have the parallel to that, which is Neil, who's walking around in the 1960s saying that I'm a part of NASA's special program. So then when you follow that with the other piece of the puzzle, which is the typical resurrection case with all of the bedrock facts, what you get is some prior evidence that you didn't have access to or didn't consider previously that raises the probability of this event. So you have recalibrated the plausibility. If God exists and is able to do this, and if Jesus was saying just watch and see, and then you have these bedrock facts where Jesus really did die, people thought he appeared to them after his death, they were willing to die for it, that makes for a stronger case. Now, here's the interesting thing. He speaks as though I made up this idea of recalibrated plausibility. I didn't. I made up the term recalibrated plausibility. The idea that stands behind it has been in the literature for a long time. That's why it's important to actually read the literature, and you don't even have to read that far. If you would just pick up something like Reasonable Faith by William Lane Craig, the most obvious apologetic resource one could think of, you would find a whole section on how Jesus viewed himself. So this isn't that big of a deal. You can locate this stuff on your own. It's just not that hard. So I called it recalibrated plausibility, though, for a reason. I don't think people focus enough on this part of the case. And some people don't even mention it at all. So I gave it a name because basically marketing, that gets people to pay attention to it. And did it work? Why, yes, it did work. In fact, you made a video, Godless Engineer, with recalibrated plausibility right on the front of it. So it's succeeding in what I want, which is to people to pay attention to this background information we have before we consider the resurrection case, that God exists and that Jesus thought of himself as God's special eschatological agent to bring about the kingdom. That raises the probability. All you did was criticize the analogy and not the point. You said, look, we have evidence of Neil walking on the moon. We have evidence of NASA. We have evidence of all these things. Well, that's right, isn't it? And guess what? We have evidence that God exists, but you didn't address that evidence. We have evidence that Jesus thought of himself as God's eschatological agent. You didn't address that evidence. But the point is not, we know Neil walked on the moon because we have video footage of it. The point is, we're assessing the reliability the plausibility of the event based on the testimony of the people in the coffee shop. And when we add in the background evidence that there is a sufficient power and Jesus was making the claim, we get, or in the case of Neil, that NASA exists and Neil was making the claim, we get this holistic picture that I think works. That's all that's being said here. So we got the criticism of the analogy, but not the point of the analogy. But I think Godless Engineer is a smart guy. I think he would have understood that. I think he would get the point of the analogy. I wonder if he says anything that reveals that all along, before all this mockery, that he really did get the point. Let's see.
Third, I get what you're trying to say here, that it's important to take previous information into account when you're assessing the probability that something happened in history.
Oh, you do get that, huh? You understand what I was saying. You get the point of the analogy and not just the analogy. Fantastic. So it makes us wonder, what was this whole song and dance about? Why is it that we had to go through all this business about footage of Neil and everything else and all these sorts of things? I'll tell you what that was about. That was the mockery that we've mentioned already. That was the same thing that we discussed earlier, where it's just rhetoric and that sort of thing. But if he had done this in a measured way, he would have started here and said, I get what you're saying. You got to consider the background data. And then we could have had a reasonable statement from him on this. Now let's see what he says next about that point of the analogy.
I agree. I couldn't agree more.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Godless Engineer.
You should definitely take the evidence into account.
Oh, thank you. I try to.
But the problem with your argument here, Braxton, is that the evidence that you're presenting...
You see the air quotes again. That's more of the rhetoric. That we're not going to talk too much about the evidence. We're just going to do air quotes.
Isn't actually evidence and doesn't actually support your case.
It's the same old, same old.
Okay, yeah. So now we're on to the next bit, which is Doug at Pine Creek. So he all he says is he's like, I get the point. You want to consider the background data, but you didn't give us any evidence for that, or your evidence isn't real evidence or something. Well, first of all, you didn't deal substantially with the evidence I gave. You said I didn't give any. So you didn't deal with Tacitus or anything else. I think he did say something about the 1 Corinthians 15 thing and believers almost immediately after the events making statements about it. But if he did deal with that, as I think he did in the original video, then okay, then he does know that I gave evidence. But originally he was saying you didn't give one piece of evidence. All right, so he says I didn't give evidence. I gave evidence, and he didn't deal substantially with my evidence. Secondly, part of that evidence, and the reason I say that is because a lot of it had to do with God's existence, so that we don't presume God, but so that we can be set up for the resurrection. And he didn't deal at all with the arguments for God's existence. The resurrection case for a classical apologist like myself doesn't stand on its own. I use God's existence first so that we have a force to raise Jesus from the dead. So to just criticize the resurrection case alone might hit the mark with someone like Gary Habermas or Mike Licona, who are evidentialists who just deal with those things, but it doesn't handle the case that a classicalist will bring, like myself. All right, so let's move on now. We've seen one guy. We've seen the bombastic statements, the big claims, those kind of things, and now we're going to hear from Doug at Pine Creek, and let's see what Doug has to
Support
say.
your case.
It's the same old, same old.
Okay, he says it's the same old, same old. Now, I want to make a point now that I forgot to make about Godless Engineer, and I'll make it here about Doug. There are certain statements that if you pay attention to the atheist YouTube community, you'll notice that they say over and over and over again. There are a number of, and I don't think anyone's teaching them to say this, I think just pick it up by osmosis as they listen to these videos and watch debates and stuff. But they come up with certain kind of party line statements that they have to say anytime a Christian apologist says anything at all, especially when particular pieces of evidence are brought by the apologist. One of those that you'll get in all the YouTube atheist comments, and you'll get it from people like Doug, is, well, this is just the same stuff we've heard time and time again. Okay. Interestingly, in this case, he begins this discussion by talking about my free will argument for the existence of God. Now, there have been people in the history of Christian thought who have talked about how free will doesn't seem possible in the absence of God, not real libertarian freedom. They've talked about that. C.S. Lewis has made statements like that. William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland in one obscure video say something related to that. Donald J. Johnson, a former visiting professor at Trinity, in a cumulative case sort of approach, has mentioned free will, but not in a deductive argument and not in a debate. I'd like for Doug or somebody to point me to another well-known Christian apologist who has used the free will argument as I've used it, as a deductive argument in a debate, especially not with the phrasing and language that I'm using. I'm not aware of it. Now, there may be someone out there who uses a deductive argument, but the wording in this argument, I came up with that. It's language that I borrowed from William Lane Craig's moral argument. So I'd like to know who it is that's seen this or said this before, since you say that this is just the same old stuff. What I suggest to you is probably happening, because there were actually some statements in some YouTube comments where the YouTube atheist would say, oh my gosh, this is the same stuff, nothing new at all. And I hate this new free will argument that I've never heard before. I mean, I'm not even dressing it up or exaggerating. I've had those kind of statements. And so it leads me to believe this is just one of those party lines that anytime a Christian apologist opens his mouth, the skeptic has to say, well, it's nothing new. Secondly, so what if it was nothing new? You got to deal with the argument itself. And the fact that you're pointing out, oh, it's nothing new, instead of dealing with the argument itself, is more like more of this rhetoric and stuff like that. So things I wanted to point out. Another example of that was when Godless Engineer goes off about the consensus. Why is it that he was so jazzed to go off about the consensus when he then later had to, in post-production, put in a response to an evidential point that I brought? Why is that? It's because I suspect, I can't know their minds, but I suspect, because I see this so often, that that's another one of those things that is just a party line that anytime someone brings any kind of a minimal facts sort of approach or mentions the bedrock facts or mentions the scholars at all, then you got to say all these apologists do is mention the scholars. No, it's not all we do, but it is an important piece of the puzzle for those who are actually interested in getting to the truth, because these scholars have spent a lot of time working through it. Do you want to take the opinions of scholars seriously, or some guy on YouTube that has no credentials? I don't know if he has no credentials. I'm just saying in many cases the YouTuber doesn't have any credentials, and that goes on both sides of this. Okay, I'm just saying. So let's move on and see what Doug has to say.
Okay, so I'm not going to actually push back on most of what he says, like the arguments, because it's been done so many times. I just want to say that Christians, have you figured out yet that these arguments don't persuade most people? The first argument.
Okay, so he says, I've done it so many times before. I just want to point out that these arguments don't persuade people. And so I don't even need to respond to it, we hear him saying, because people have already debunked these things. That's the tone of what we're getting here. It's really interesting because he says they don't persuade people, but I have seen really great evidence that they do persuade people. I'm trying to pull up a PowerPoint here. So do these arguments actually make a difference? Okay, so here is a statement from Drew Pystrip in a blog article on my website called Away from Atheism. It was a guest blog from Drew. And Drew's mother had come to me and said that her son is in his early 20s. He's an atheist, but he's a non-resistant atheist. He's open to hearing what people have to say about this, what a Christian thinker would have to say. And here's what Drew said. He said, "We met for lunch at a local Mexican restaurant, and that's when my life really changed for the better. We continued meeting and discussing God and the truth about Jesus. I was baffled at how much evidence there really is. No one had ever talked to me about Christian apologetics. It surprised me to hear that there were people out there that are trying to give evidence of God, for God's existence and who Jesus was. Apologetics made me take a second look at what religion was and why Christianity is worth believing." So you can check out that entire article on my website. And I want to point out, Drew became a Christian, and then he actually enrolled for a time into an apologetics program at our school, and even came to work for our school answering phones, so that the first person that people heard was this former atheist, now Christian, enrolled in a Christian apologetics program because he wants to share this evidence with others. Now, Drew no longer works at our school. He's moved on to other things, but I just think it goes to show that apologetics really does work. And one thing that Doug likes to point out, in fact, he told me in a conversation on JMD Apologetics 101 that in a text-based discussion in the comments, he told me that he calls BS on this idea that people really get convinced by apologetics. He says he thinks it's good for Christians to firm up what they believe, but not good for skeptics. And I think we see here that's simply not true. And Drew's not the only one. I've seen many, many people come to Christ, and God used apologetics to reach that point in their lives. So just wanted to point that out. So I think what Christians need to point out to atheists is, are you guys seeing yet that these things are persuasive? Are you guys beginning to notice? Because you may be kind of in a bubble. Now, I don't know that, but it may be that you're in kind of a bubble in the YouTube atheist world. And I don't doubt that you have real conversations with real people that are not on the internet. But if all you were looking at was comment sections of YouTube videos where atheists are commenting, then yeah, I can see that feeling that way. But what I'm seeing regularly, just this past week, I spoke 5 times on a weekend in Sarasota, Florida, and I saw all kinds of people interested in this evidence, and I've seen people in many of these events coming to Christ, God using apologetics. So this is just rhetoric. There's nothing that he uses to back this up. He's just making a statement and an assertion, and that's fine. You can share your opinion. Just don't expect that we should have to accept your opinion or something like that.
Making is the free will argument that if there's no free will, that.
Oh, by the way, the video is a little bit laggy here for Doug. I'm not sure why. It wasn't on his original video. Something happened on this version, but you can still get the content.
Can't be. No, if we do have free will, that there has to be a God. One of the thoughts that popped into my head was, Braxton, do you believe that your God, that Yahweh, has free will? That's a big, big issue, I think, because I think a lot of Christians really want God to have free will, but as soon as they admit that he does, a lot of problems start to unfold, like the problem of suffering.
Okay, now he doesn't tell us what problems unfold. He says like the problem of suffering, but he doesn't explain why there would be a problem. What does God's having freedom tell us about the problem of suffering? Now he could be pointing to something like the question that Matt raised in the debate during the question and answer time, where Matt said, could not God have actualized a world in which I remained a Christian or became a Christian or whatever? And my answer to him was, yeah, if God was aware of all the different possible worlds, for those of you that are familiar with possible world semantics, we don't mean worlds that actually exist, but worlds that don't have any contradictions, that's a possible world. A world that does have contradictions or is otherwise incoherent is an impossible world. So are there possible worlds? Is there a possible world where Matt remains a Christian or becomes a Christian? Yes, there is a possible world like that. Oh, well, then why didn't God choose to create that one? Isn't God free to do that? Well, the thing is, a possible world is just that. It's a possible world. But when you give man libertarian freedom, where he can make real choices, you get a subset of possible worlds that we refer to as feasible worlds. And in those feasible worlds, that's what men actually choose to do in the worlds where they have freedom of the will. And you may not get everything in the feasible worlds that you get in the possible worlds. For example, if you give Matt Dillahunty freedom of the will, it may be that in no world of free creatures does Matt freely choose to be a Christian. That may be the case. And if so, if God wants to give man freedom of the will, well, then guess what? He can't actualize now a world where Matt Dillahunty is a Christian, because there may not be such a world. And especially in Matt's case, where he says he wouldn't believe in God even if he saw a man part the ocean in Jesus' name, or wouldn't believe even that anything supernatural has happened, then yeah, if that's true, then I think it's likely that there's not a feasible world where Matt, given libertarian freedom, would freely choose to be a Christian. I don't know if that's the kind of objection that PineCreek Doug here is raising, because he didn't elaborate. He just kind of threw it up there on the wall. He accuses me of throwing a bunch of spaghetti against the wall to see what'll stick. I think that was a little bit of spaghetti coming from Doug, and it didn't stick. If there's something else, I'm not sure about that. Now, some people have a problem with God. This is a more reasonable reason to object to God having free will, because God knows everything that he will do. And so if God knows what he will do, then isn't he bound to do that he will know he will do? Now, this is the same problem with God knowing what free creatures will do. It's the modal fallacy that people commit. It's called it's a causal fallacy. It's that knowledge isn't causal. Knowledge of some event doesn't make that event. It doesn't do anything to that event. It's just knowledge of that event. And that's even true for God about his own actions. He knows what he will freely do. However, that's an objection. Another objection would be that if God is bound by his nature, his good nature, to only always do the maximally good thing, well, then God must always do only one thing. Therefore, God doesn't have libertarian free will, some would argue. However, this strikes back to an important distinction that's a little bit of a discussion among libertarians, but it's usually not too controversial. There are two things related to free will. One is the idea that I could have done something differently. That's called the principle of alternative possibilities, that whatever I end up doing, I could have done otherwise. You'll usually see it abbreviated as PAP, P-A-P. On the other hand, you have, and that is sufficient for libertarian free will, but not necessary. What is both necessary and sufficient for libertarian freedom is that you are the originator of your actions and that nothing outside of you determined your actions. This is why God must have libertarian freedom, because even if you wanted to argue that God doesn't have the principle of alternative possibilities, you cannot argue that something outside of God determined his actions, since there was no prior determinism to lead to God's actions. He is the originator of his actions, even if he didn't have the principle of alternative possibilities. So does God have libertarian freedom? Yes. Does that cause problems? Not that I can see. And until Doug or someone else wants to lay out for me what those problems are, I'll happily remain convinced that we and God have libertarian freedom. But you need to do something more than just assert that it causes problems. I need to know what those problems are. But see, this is the kind of thing that happens when you actually, I think sometimes these questions are raised. And again, remember, questions are not arguments, like Cameron Bertuzzi says. But then secondly, you need to understand that these things have been thought about. I mean, none of these questions that are raised by Doug are things that Christians haven't been thinking about and talking about for a really long time. Now, it may be that some YouTube Christians that, stroll onto your comments feed don't know about these things or haven't talked about them. But those who have sought higher education in these matters and have really tried to study the journal articles and see what both atheists and Christians say about this, this is not new territory. These are things that we as Christians actually debate in-house, as we're going to see in just a moment.
Now, here's the thing. There's a lot of Christians who don't believe in this type of free will. And they're called Calvinists. In fact, I even think a lot of non-Calvinists don't believe in the strong version of free will, because I can ask this question. Christians, do you believe that you have the free will to accept the gift of salvation through Jesus Christ without any input from the Holy Spirit? Think about it. And so a lot of Christians...
Okay, so here's a couple of interesting things. So number one, there are Calvinists out there. Really? I didn't know that. I've had 4 debates with Calvinists. I'm sorry, I'm starting to get a little bit snarky, but I have 4 debates with Calvinists. They're some of my favorite debates that I've done. My favorite debate is my debate with Joe Myra. But Leighton Flowers and I have done 2 debates together, and then I have another debate with a Calvinist, Paul Cooper, no longer a Calvinist. But yeah, I'm fully aware of the Calvinist dialogue. That's how I arrived at the free will argument. Is I had years spent having Calvinist debates and really felt like I should get back into apologetics and evangelism and try to reach people who are not believers. And so I wanted to use some of that knowledge I had of free will in this arena too. So I put this argument together based on the knowledge I gained from the Calvinism discussions. I don't know how it is that the existence of Calvinists, the fact that some people are Calvinists, means that I have a problem on my view. You need to tell me, like, if you want to make a case, you need to tell me what the Calvinists are saying that you think holds water internally within Christianity that makes this not work. He does a little bit of that about the Holy Spirit. So let's talk about that now. So could someone become a Christian without the input of the Holy Spirit? No. But what does that have to do with libertarian freedom? See, what the Holy Spirit does is he makes the offer to a person. The Bible teaches that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. So the Holy Spirit is at work when the gospel is preached. And so whenever someone hears the offer, whenever they hear the gospel presentation, they hear that gospel offer, they are able to respond as far as I'm concerned. Do all Calvinists agree with that? No, but I'm not a Calvinist. Apparently you feel drawn to Calvinism as an approach to Christianity. And Doug, if you would become a Christian and be a Calvinist, I would be thrilled, because Calvinists are my brothers and sisters in Christ, and I thank God for them. We just disagree about this. But I don't have a problem with saying that when someone hears the gospel, or if they don't hear the gospel, but maybe if they get the truth of the gospel through general revelation, then God sends someone like with Cornelius, God sends someone else to give them the gospel. That's kind of how I see that working. But the gospel is the thing. And so when someone hears the gospel, I believe they can respond. So can someone get saved without the Holy Spirit? No, but the Holy Spirit is at work when someone hears the gospel. So for that reason, it's kind of like saying, can you come over to my house for dinner if you haven't been invited over to my house for dinner? Well, no, but I have to hear the invitation. But if you make the invitation, then now I can. What does any of that have to do with my libertarian freedom? I just don't see a problem there. If there is a problem, someone's going to have to tell me what it is.
Disagree with this whole concept of free will. They call themselves Calvinists or hyper-Calvinists sometimes. And so I really don't think that you can link free will with any type of deity. Okay, so he says, this is his final word on this. He says, so there are people that don't believe in free will, Braxton, that are Christians, these Calvinists, so I don't think you can link this to any kind of deity. Since when is truth dependent on what other people think? Now, it doesn't matter to me. This is where I agree with Godless Engineer. If the fact that the consensus about Jesus' resurrection is there helps me make my case. But I'm happy to admit the consensus can be wrong about facts. You just need to show me where they're wrong. And here, the fact that there are Christians, and it's not the consensus of Christians, by the way, that believe that we are determined, that determinism is true, that we don't have libertarian freedom. The fact that they exist means that you can't have a deity that has libertarian freedom. What's the syllogism there? I really want to know what are the premises there, because I don't think that works. But let's go on. question to Braxton would be, if you became convinced someday that you are not free, would you leave Christianity? I honestly don't know how he would answer that. I think he would still believe in God. And I think most believers would answer that way. So really, is this an argument? Is this free will argument really that powerful? Does it really mean anything if you became convinced that there was absolutely no free will, the ability to do otherwise? If you would still believe in God, still believe in Christianity, then what are we really talking about here? See, and this is
Okay, so first of all, going in reverse order, we notice that he again characterized libertarian freedom as merely the principle of alternative possibilities, the ability to do otherwise. And that just demonstrates that there's a little bit of a lack of familiarity with the literature on this. But now let me answer the question. So is it a powerful argument? Okay, there's two questions here. So first of all, if I found out that I didn't have libertarian freedom, if I found out that that was not true and that, say, the Calvinists were right, would I give up my Christianity? No. I guess I would have to be a Calvinist. Okay. Now, so does that mean that it's not a powerful argument? Well, table that for a second. Let me answer this first. First of all you're asking is a question about my own psychology. Like, what does Braxton Hunter think? What in the world does that have to do with truth? And this is where we get back to the whole rhetoric, emotion, that sort of thing. And this happens a lot in street epistemology, where they're not making arguments so much as they are asking questions. And again, questions aren't arguments. And so that's a piece of this. What in the world does it matter if what my personal psychology is on this, what would make me believe or not? What matters is the truth. Now, does that mean it's not a powerful argument? Let's say that someone told me that my wife was going to be, that my wife had told them that she was going to be home at 3:00 in the afternoon. Okay. So I have this experiential sort of information that she's going to be at home at 3:00 in the afternoon. So I believe it. And I get there. I think the testimony is good. I think that sounds like what I know. So I get home, I go in the door at 3:00, expecting my wife, or at 3:15, let's say, expecting my wife to be there. And when I get in, I notice that her shoes are by the door. That would make sense if she's at home. Her purse is in the chair. That would make sense because she wouldn't be leaving without her shoes or her purse. And then on the kitchen counter, I see that the keys are laying there, her car keys. So now I really think she's probably at home because those car keys are there. Now, I haven't seen my wife yet. Let's say she's maybe in the back room or something. But so I have this experiential information. Someone testified to me that she was going to be home at 3:00. And then I have the shoes, the purse, and the keys on the counter. Now, what you're asking me is similar to this. But what if you came home and the keys were not on the counter? Like the purse and the shoes were there, but the keys were not on the counter. Would you still believe your wife is home? Yeah, probably. Oh, so then the keys being on the counter isn't powerful evidence that she's at home. Oh no, it's great evidence that she's at home. It confirms, it serves as further evidence, really good, powerful evidence that she is at home. But if they weren't there, would I think that she wasn't at home? No, she just may not have put her keys on the counter, right? Okay, well, yeah, but what if, Braxton, the keys and the purse weren't there, but her shoes were all that was there? Would you still believe she was at home? Probably. Oh, so the purse isn't powerful evidence either, or the keys. No, those are still powerful pieces of evidence. So let's just get to what you really want to ask. If there was no keys, no purse, and no shoes, would I still believe? In other words, if there was no extra evidence beyond what I had from personal testimony or my experiential knowledge from what someone told me, would I still believe that she was at home? Probably, but that doesn't mean that the shoes, the purse, and the keys are not still powerful pieces of evidence that she is at home. Now, if someone wanted to ask the further question, and say, what if you had no evidence that she's at home? Like nobody told you, you had no reason to believe it, and there was no keys, purse, or shoes, then would you believe she was at home? Well, probably not, or I'd be completely agnostic about whether or not she's at home. But that's not the situation I have. So what Doug would like to ask me, I think, is, what if you had no evidence for God's existence or the Christian God, including your own personal testimony and personal experience with God? You had no evidence, no reason to think that God exists. Wouldn't you still be a Christian? No, I wouldn't. I'm happy to tell you I wouldn't. I would be agnostic on the question, just like I'd be agnostic about whether or not my wife is at home. But the fact that but basically what you're saying is let's ignore all of the incredible evidence that we have and then ask, would you still believe? Well, no, but why would I ignore all this incredible evidence? The fact that the keys are on the counter, the fact that I have the free will argument and the cosmological argument and the resurrection case are powerful confirmatory pieces of evidence. And the fact that I would still be a Christian if I didn't have one or more of those doesn't mean that I don't have good reason to believe in Christianity. But it certainly doesn't mean that they're not powerful pieces of evidence in their own right. So I hope that helps. Let's move forward.
A problem that a lot of Christians struggle with, because on one hand, they're going to hear a guy like Braxton say, yes, how can there be free will if we're just molecules in motion? And so there has to be free will. But on the other hand, they believe in the sovereignty of God. And they just embrace both. They just embrace the paradox. But they believe that things happen for reasons, that nothing happens for no reason. There's a lot of Christians believe that there's no such thing as coincidences. This is all part of God's plan. This is a great point Braxton is bringing up. He's bringing up basically moral responsibility and how that fits in with determinism. And so if you're a Christian listening, what Braxton just said, this is what you should hammer home.
Okay, so first of all, I love this because, thank you, Doug. Doug is saying this thing about morality and how if freedom, let me just clarify, if libertarian freedom does not exist, that you're not the originator of your actions, or that you don't have the principle of alternative possibility, if that doesn't exist, if all is determined, then people are not really morally praiseworthy or blameworthy for what they do, because whatever they do, they could not have done otherwise. So if someone builds a well for thirsty people in another country, they're not praiseworthy for that because they had to do that. Now, they didn't experience it as they're having to do it. They thought through these things, but they had to do it. And so for that reason, they're not really praiseworthy. It's just something they did that they were determined and programmed to do. If someone engages in a hate crime against black people or homosexuals or women or whatever, then they're not really culpable for that. They're not really morally responsible for that because they had to do it. They were determined to do that just as much as the person who builds the well for thirsty people in Africa or whatever was determined to do that. So you see, this determinism really, is a problem for moral responsibility. Now, what we still can do, and this is what guys like Doug, I think he may point it out here in a moment, and it's what Dillahunty has said, is, well, we can still hold them responsible. Like, they may not be ultimately blameworthy, but they are incarceratable, right? We can put them in prison or something. But notice, you're going to have to say that when someone kills a gay person or something in a hate crime, you can't get upset at them. You can't, and if you do, it's only to try and make the behavior stop. You can incarcerate them, but you cannot hold them ultimately blameworthy because they could not have done otherwise. They had to do it. So that is a very strange position. And Doug actually says this is what you need to hammer home, because I think this is actually a good point from your perspective. Thank you, Doug. I really appreciate that. Now, this other thing about sovereignty, he says, I don't think Christians realize, they just kind of hold this as, an antinomy or something, that God is sovereign and in control. Everything happens for a reason, but yeah, we're supposed to have libertarian freedom. Okay, well, let's think about that for a minute. What sovereignty means, this is the same mistake that I think a lot of my Calvinist brothers and sisters make. Sovereignty has a meaning. And words don't super mean things just because you're talking about God. They may refer to bigger things. Let me give you an example. A sovereign is a king. A king is in control of his domain. He's in control of his realm. He can step in at any time. He can dole out rewards or punishments. He can do as he pleases. These are all things that the Bible says God can do with his domain. And his domain is the entire cosmos. It's the whole universe. That's what's bigger when we're talking about God's sovereignty, is his realm is bigger. But what sovereignty does not mean, and has never meant, and when people take sovereignty and make it a theological term and then put all this philosophy on it, it's a huge mistake. What many Calvinists think, is that sovereignty is synonymous with meticulous divine determinism of all things. That is not what sovereignty means. And unfortunately, a lot of times people will say to someone, well, you believe God's sovereign, right? Well, yeah, of course I believe God. I'm a Christian. I believe God's sovereign. Oh, so you think that God meticulously determines all things? You're a Calvinist. No, I'm not a Calvinist. But you believe God's sovereign, right? If you believe God's sovereign, you need to be a Calvinist. Oh, okay, well, I guess I'm a Calvinist then. That's not what's going on here. Sovereignty just means It just refers to the position of authority. God is in a position of sovereign authority over all things. How he exercises that sovereignty is a separate question. So we actually have a category error here. So is it possible to hold that God is maximally sovereign, as sovereign as he could be, and at the same time we have libertarian freedom? Absolutely, because the Bible doesn't say that sovereignty is meticulous divine determinism. And do some things happen that God doesn't want? Yeah, I think some things happen that God doesn't like. But in the because remember, go back to our discussion of feasible worlds of free creatures. I think that God actualized the world of free creatures that best met what he ultimately wanted. But this means that there's going to be a lot of things in that world of free creatures that God didn't want. God didn't want for child rape and things like this to happen. But in the best of all feasible worlds where man has libertarian freedom, some of these evils happen. This helps greatly with the problem of suffering, despite Doug's previous comments that this causes some kind of problem for suffering. So those two things are really helpful. One is that there's a difference between sovereignty and meticulous divine determinism. And secondly, I appreciate that Doug thinks that this moral issue is pretty powerful. Thank you.
Possible, Braxton, that we have libertarian free will and there's no God? Like, you need to establish a connection between free will and a God, don't you? Okay, remember what I said?
Okay, so he says here, now this clip, he's going back to premise 1 of my argument. You'll recall my free will argument is, if God does not exist, then libertarian freedom does not exist. Premise 2, libertarian freedom does exist, therefore God exists. What he's saying is, I didn't challenge, or I didn't present enough supporting evidence for premise 1 of that argument. I focused on premise 2, which was libertarian freedom does exist. Well, I did actually provide some connection between God and libertarian freedom. I said in my opening statements that if God does not exist, then the universe is just a natural system of cause and effect. And that seems to be the case. In fact, that's why the majority of atheist philosophers are determinists, is because they recognize that. There's just no way to get there if naturalism is true. It's just a natural system, some would say a closed system of cause and effect. Secondly, I would say that there is an interesting telos, or design, in libertarian freedom. Now remember, in premise 1, we're not talking about whether it exists. We're talking about the connection between God and libertarian freedom. And so presuming that libertarian freedom exists, because that'll get challenged in premise 2, okay? Trying to be clear here. So in premise 1, we're talking about what's the connection between God and libertarian freedom. There's an interesting design in libertarian freedom. 100% of the benefits that come to us from libertarian freedom are, as far as I can tell, moral responsibility, love, the ability to make rational affirmations, and pure, genuine altruism. Those are the 4 things. I can't think of anything else. And if anyone can, I hope they'll email them to me. But moral responsibility, love, rational affirmations, and pure altruism. All 4 of those, you'll notice, are necessary for meaningful relationships. And so this makes sense to me of a personal God who wants people to be in relationship. Interestingly, the Bible says that we're made in God's image, and it also says that we're to love the Lord our God and love our neighbor as ourselves. So I think this design that seems intrinsic to libertarian freedom, and I don't know that we had to have libertarian freedom, so it's interesting that we have it, and 100% of the benefits it gives us are these things that probably aren't necessary if naturalism is true, but they provide for relationships. So that's another thing. Thirdly, one of the things you do when you're trying to figure out what's true is you think, what would we expect under certain worldviews or certain systems? If we took naturalism to be true, should we expect that we would have libertarian freedom? I don't think so. But if we took theism to be true, would we expect us to have libertarian freedom? I think so. And the reason is because if theism is true, then at least one libertarianly free being certainly exists if theism is true, because as I said previously in this video, there would be no prior determinism to lead to God's choices to create. So God would at least have libertarian freedom. So on theism, libertarian freedom is already a thing, so it makes sense that we would have it. On naturalistic atheism, there's no way to get to libertarian freedom. It doesn't make sense that we'd have libertarian freedom. So anyway, those are some thoughts on that. So let's move. But I would have laid out more of that than I did in my opening statements if I'd been challenged on it. This is the same as what I said to Godless Engineer. The job of my opponent is to attack what I've said and to press me on what I've said. we could have had a discussion about premise 1, but Matt stuck strictly to, and our conversation stuck strictly to premise 2, whether libertarian freedom does exist. And on that point, we went back and forth quite a bit. Notice the next comment from Doug.
Throwing spaghetti against the walls. This was all under the free will, but then he threw in rationalization, moral responsibility in there. It's just going to get worse.
Okay, now notice what he's done here. He's saying that I'm doing what is typically called a gish gallop. That's where or it's also called shotgunning with evidence. It's where you throw out so much stuff that you just want to, well, really the reason you do that is so that your opponent can't possibly get through all that you said, right? And then you could point out at the end, see, he didn't respond to this or that. But I didn't do that. I presented 2 arguments and a case for the resurrection. What did Matt Dillahunty do? He brought a testimonial sort of testimony, basically, of his deconversion experience, and then he mentioned 2 kind of arguments, divine hiddenness and what he called inconsistent revelation. So we each brought 3 things. Not that big of a deal. The moral stuff and the rational stuff, those were supporting arguments for premise 2 of my moral argument. And notice, though he's criticizing me for throwing spaghetti against the wall, he has just the last thing we discussed, he asked me to throw more spaghetti at the wall when it comes to premise 1. He wanted me to say more about premise 1. So on the one hand, he's saying, I need you to give me more spaghetti on the wall. And the next one, you're just throwing spaghetti against the wall. Unbelievable.
Now, for those who are familiar with these discussions, you might say, come on.
Sorry, it's just going to get better.
Braxton, you're not going to...
He even realizes this is an old, tired argument, but he's going to say it anyhow.
Okay, so here we get to the Kalam cosmological argument, and what Doug says is, oh, see, Braxton even knows this is an old, tired argument. That's because what I said in the debate was, I said, oh, you're probably thinking, Braxton, you're not going to bring the old Kalam argument again. Yeah, I've got a personal philosophy for my life. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it ain't broke, folks. Yeah. So I realize it's an old argument. Tired, I'm not sure what you mean by tired. If you mean something like ineffective, I don't think so. It's an old argument, but why does an argument being old matter at all to how powerful it is? I keep hearing from people like Matt Dillahunty and like Doug in this very video when he says, when are you guys going to realize this stuff doesn't work? And we talked about that. I keep hearing from people that this argument has been debunked. These arguments are old and tired. They've been settled already. Really? Where have these arguments been settled? Doug is even going to point to Rationality Rules, another channel, another guy, a UK guy who's supposed to have settled this. But the problem that Rationality Rules raises is the problem, well, we'll get to it in a moment because Doug's going to raise it. I don't know if he got it from Rationality Rules, but probably so since he mentions him. But it's interesting because the issue that Rationality Rules guy raises is actually featured in a speech by William Lane Craig at Biola that you can find online, where he's going through the top 10 worst objections to the Kalam cosmological argument. And so it's interesting because he doesn't mention Rationality Rules, but people think that this guy has like settled this. It's baffling, and we'll see why he hasn't settled it when Doug raises it here in just a moment.
Everything in our experience is that everything that begins to exist in our physical experience has a material cause.
Here it is.
So therefore, shouldn't we say our universe had a material cause? And basically, they get around that and saying, well, no, it has to be outside our time, our space, our matter, but so can something material could be outside our time, our space, our matter. And so Christians realize this, but apologists keep spewing it. I don't know. But let me
see, here's the subtle condescension. Christians realize this. You guys keep spewing this, but people see this. People know that this is easy to debunk. Really? This is like one of the most powerful evidences for God. Frankly, I feel like, and I think Doug's a nice guy, and I don't think he means to be disingenuous. And maybe he's not. Maybe he believes everything he's saying. But this, I think, when a lot of people say it, is a bit disingenuous for the following reason. Whenever an atheist brings the problem of evil, for example, an argument from evil, especially an evidential argument from evil, you know what? I grant that is a powerful argument. Now, I think we have a response to it. I think we have a response that overcomes the evidential arguments from evil that someone like William Rowe or somebody like that might bring. But here's the thing. I don't brush it off. This is so stupid. In fact, I tell Christians when someone raises this, take it seriously. That's pretty good. But that's what you get from a measured, reasonable discussion. When you say something like, about the Kalam cosmological argument of all things. When you say, oh, Christians see this, it's just so blah, blah, blah. Listen, actually Christians do see this. And I remember I remember witnessing to a guy just down the street from where I lived on one occasion, and I shared with him the Kalam cosmological argument. He was an atheist. And in one conversation, he was like, that is extremely powerful. Okay. And he moved that day from atheism to at least some kind of agnosticism or deism. Why? Because that is a powerful argument. What are you talking about when you say, I mean, seriously, if you guys, I grant you, there are people out there who in some cases already have a moral motivation not to believe. That's not everybody. In some cases already have some doubts. And when they hear you say things like this, maybe it moves them. Okay. I grant you that happens. There are people that leave the church because of this kind of rhetoric that doesn't really deal with the major issues. But there are other Christians who may be really working through their beliefs, and they see this. They understand the power of the cosmological argument, and you will never get them, and you'll only confirm them in their theism, at least, with this kind of a statement, because they know this is an incredibly powerful argument. Now, what was his response? I had said in my statements that 100% of our experience confirms that when something begins to exist, it must have a cause. What I suspect he got from Rationality Rules, because he says it, is this thing about, no, everything in our experience points to when something begins to exist as a material cause, which may in itself have some problems, but has a material cause. So there is a equivocation between the cause that's mentioned at the first and the cause that's mentioned in the conclusion. Everything that begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause. There's a conflation, they think, between those two words, cause, because they say in the one sense you're talking about a material cause, and in the other sense you're talking about an efficient cause. No, in both cases we're talking about an efficient cause. This is why this is one of the top 10 worst objections to the Kalam cosmological argument, is because it's just a misunderstanding of the different uses of the terms that are related to causation. This isn't hard to handle. Now, his other statement about, well, why do you say it has to be spaceless, timeless, non-material, these sorts of things, when there could be something outside of our universe that is also spatial, temporal, material, that sort of thing. This demonstrates, again, someone who hasn't taken the time to not just listen to videos, but read the journal articles, read the books on this, and see what exactly we're saying. And in the debate itself that he's playing, I said it twice because Matt raised similar objections. And that is, we're not just talking about our local representation of the universe. Even if you want to posit multiverses and vacuum models and whatever else, we're talking about all contiguous physical reality. If you go outside of our physical universe and there's some other physical universe, then guess what? You have to go further back. You haven't gone further back enough. And it's this impossibility of an infinite regression of causal events and temporal moments that leads to this conclusion. There's more to it than this, and this kind of an objection just doesn't work because it, excuse me, because it doesn't take into account what the theist is actually saying.
Ask you this, Braxton. If it were true that our universe did not have a cause, would you leave Christianity? Would you stop believing in a God? Yeah, what if time doesn't go in one direction? What if time goes backwards?
Oh, okay, this is another thing. So now he's asking me the same thing here that he's asking me about free will. If our universe didn't have a cause. Now that's an interesting way of putting it. If he means by that, if our universe doesn't find its explanation for its existence in something else, then would I still be a Christian? That's a tough one, because I don't know what that would do to, I don't know. I'd have to think about that, honestly. That could be a powerful piece of evidence that would be thrown into the discussion. But I really think what Doug's asking me here is, if you didn't have the Kalam cosmological argument, or if the universe has just existed infinitely into the past, so you didn't have this causal argument, would you still be a Christian? And again, it's like asking if the keys weren't on the counter, if the purse wasn't sitting in the chair, if the shoes weren't by the door, if you didn't have this incredible evidence, would you still believe? If I had no evidence at all, then no, I probably wouldn't believe. But why are you asking me to set aside all of this incredible evidence? And this leads me to say something really important. This is kind of a little bit of an intermission that I'll bring up here. Doug often asks this question, like, what, you guys aren't really Christians because of the evidence, are you? No. I'm a Christian probably because I was raised in a Christian household. I had an experience with God at an early age, and all of that. Yeah, that's probably why I'm a Christian. I found out about the evidence later on in my early 20s. But you know what? I remain a Christian, however you want to frame that up soteriologically, because when I took my worldview apart and put it back together to see if it held water, the evidence is incredibly important to me. And when I look back, when I even now think of the best reasons to believe outside of my own personal experience with God, I think of things like this. That's why I raise them. That's why I bring them. So, it's not like a point in favor of the atheist if the reason I initially became a Christian didn't have anything directly to do with the evidence. The evidence is still there. You still have to deal with the evidence. These are like ways of trying to circumvent via doubt and emotion and rhetoric, trying to circumvent the actual evidence. You've still got to deal with the evidence. Let's say every Christian on planet Earth, and it's not true, but let's say every Christian on planet Earth came to believe based on their upbringing and that alone. You still have to deal with this evidence. All right, that's the important piece. So it's worth noting. Oh, another thing he asked me, he said, well, why do you think Muslims believe what they believe for the most part? And I said, probably because they want Islam to be true and they were raised in it and these sorts of things. And and in a private, or not a private, but a text-based discussion on a video, he said, bingo, as if he had made a point and as if I didn't see where he was going. Of course, right. And I think a lot of Christians initially believed because of that, because they had, they were raised in it. And later they had an experience and all that. But what you still got to deal with is the arguments. I've got to deal with the Muslim apologists and what their arguments say. I've got to deal with that. I'm happy to do it. You've got to deal with the evidence. And we notice again and again here an attempt to kind of shift our focus away from the evidence and look at our own psychology to figure out what we should believe. That's a big problem. All right. So what's he now saying about time? He said, what if time jumps around, moves backwards?
If time could jump time, it's not sequential. Like all these, but time that...
Okay, so he says, what if he's responding here to the question of the universe can't be past infinite, or we would have never arrived at this moment because you have to overcome an infinite number of temporal moments and causal events. He's like, what if time goes in other directions or jumps time or whatever? First of all, what do you mean? You need to explain what you mean by that, because that frankly sounds at the very least implausible, right? It sounds like an extraordinary claim, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is what I hear from atheists all the time. So you need to tell me what in the world you mean by that. Now, the only thing I can think of is he's referring to this attempts to get around the Kalam from someone like Victor Stenger. I think William Lane Craig and Victor Stenger once had a debate, and Stenger was talking about what if at the moment of the beginning, time began to move in both directions, forward and backwards. So if you can imagine a line with arrows on either end and a point in the center for the beginning, and time is going in both directions, so you could maybe get infinite time that way. Okay, you still wouldn't get infinite time because you can't reach an infinite by successively adding through addition, 1, 2, 3, 4, because however high you count, there's always another number beyond that. Remember, infinite is not a really big number. Infinite is, there is no number for it because it goes on like literally forever, infinitely. So you still wouldn't have infinite, and you would still have a point of beginning. It's just that the point of beginning would be in the middle of that timeline instead of at one end of that timeline. So still got problems here, and if there's a deeper objection, you need to let me know what that is.
That in sequential thoughts, because they believe he's a personal God and has thoughts, and one thought can't come before another, or they can't flip, and because then God can't keep his promises in the future and stuff. These thoughts have to go in a series. And so a lot of Christians, I know some of them, believe that part of Yahweh's nature is time. Can you give...
Okay, so he is talking about God being in time, God's timelessness. And he's right. There are Christians who would say that God has to have some sort of his own timeline, or in some sense be in time, because otherwise how can he have thoughts in a succession? In fact, just when I was in Sarasota, Florida this weekend, I was having a conversation with a guy afterwards, and he raised this concern. And he liked the answer. The answer is this. Why do you think through why do we as finite human beings have to think through things? We have to think through things because when we're thinking, even among our own knowledge bank, we're learning, we're processing, we're putting thoughts together in a new arrangement to arrive at a new conclusion. But whether you believe an omniscient being exists or not, just imagine it for a moment. If a being is omniscient, does that being then need to think through a series of thoughts? No, he doesn't. Because he knows everything instantly and timelessly, and he doesn't need to think through a series of thoughts to arrive at a new conclusion. He knows it all already from the jump. That's all there is to it. You don't need to think through. And I don't know how in the world this has anything to do with God's ability to keep his promises. So are there Christians who think that way? Yes. But if you understand omniscience and that God doesn't need to think through thoughts to learn things and arrive at new conclusions, that goes right in the face of omniscience. God doesn't need to think linearly like that. He just knows everything. Now, if you think, well, that doesn't sound anything like our experience, right, we're talking about God. Even if you don't believe in God, if you can imagine the concept of God, you understand that it's going to be different for God than it is for us.
An example, Braxton Hunter, of a mind independent of the body. Usually premises have some evidence to back it up, but I'm wondering, like, Christians, if you were convinced that the mind was purely physical and there's no immaterial in it, like, would you leave Christianity? I think that one they kind of have to say yes.
However,
okay, so he's talking now about, because I said that you'd have a mind independent of a body serves as the best explanation of the beginning of the universe. Notice here, again, this kind of rhetorical idea of mockery of this very concept of a mind independent of a body. I don't know if I had it in this video, but in the original video, there's a level of laughing at that. But here's the thing. It's a spaceless, timeless, non-material cause, right? Because we're talking about what caused space, time, and physical matter, okay? It has to have causal powers. Are there things like that? Well, there are spaceless, timeless, non-material things, perhaps, if you think abstract objects, numbers, those kind of things count as spaceless, timeless, non-material. Some people think they do, but they don't do anything. They don't have causal powers. But a mind independent of a body would have causal powers. By the way, there's other reasons to believe that it's a mind. One is that it would have to have libertarian freedom because there's no prior determinism to lead to its cause at the beginning of the universe. What sorts of things have libertarian freedom? Oh, guess what? Agents do. Minds do. So you have a spaceless, timeless, non-material, sufficiently powerful, exceedingly wise, because you have to be sufficiently powerful to do it, and exceedingly wise to make sure that it happens correctly, mind. Okay? That's how we get there. Now, he wants to know, do you have any examples of a mind independent of a physical body? Yes. This argument, and I'm not the first to say so, is not just an argument for God's existence, but in being an argument for God's existence is also an argument for a mind independent of a body. It goes both ways. Now, he says, if you came to believe, now here's the keys and the purse and the shoes again. He says, if you came to believe that that there are no such things as immaterial souls or minds independent of bodies or whatever, would you then still be a Christian? He says, I think most Christians at this point would have to give it up. Now, see, here, even when he goes the other way, he misses it. Why does he miss it? Because this is, again, where you need to be aware of the literature out there on substance dualism, the idea that we are a physical body and an immaterial soul. You need to look into this stuff and read this stuff. Let's see, you could read Joel B. Green's book on physicalism. I think it's called Mind, Body, and something. You could read J.P. Moreland for the other side of that, from both Christians giving you two different perspectives. J.P. Moreland's book on the soul. In the one case, Joel B. Green is arguing for a position known as Christian physicalism. I said this in my response video for Matt Dillahunty, because he also said that in future debates he was going to raise this idea that the soul is the most dead idea in all of theology or whatever. But here's the thing. I do affirm the soul. It's very integral to my theology. However, if I found out that there was no such thing as a soul, would I stop being a Christian? No, I would not. You know why? Because there is a broad field of study out there called Christian physicalism. I think they're as wrong can be, but there are Christians who believe that substance dualism is false and you do not have an immaterial soul, that you are just a physical body. They think that when the Bible uses the word soul, it's talking about something else, like just life. So you've got to deal with all of that stuff to get to this conclusion. However, again, asking the question, would you still be a Christian if you found out there was no soul? Does that mean that there's any problem at all with the arguments that I'm bringing. No, it's not. It's just it's another question about psychology. It's another rhetorical moment. And to a large measure, this street epistemology, as it's known, which I don't know if that's what he's doing here, but he does it. This street epistemology stuff is based largely on getting people to have emotional doubt and getting people to rely or be moved by the rhetoric that we're using. So let's go ahead.
Mind without a body, a mind independent of a body, would serve as a fitting explanation and would also explain how the universe could be created from a state of nothingness which has no potentialities, no properties, no powers, and no possibilities. Thus, a spaceless, timeless, non-material, sufficiently powerful mind serves as the best explanation of the beginning of
The best explanation is this mysterious thing, this all-powerful thing, this mind that doesn't have a body. He did it. It did it. Whatever did it.
Third.
Okay, yeah, you hear the mockery there again, the rhetoric. Like, do you understand that if you're going to run a channel that is largely focused on dealing with theists, you're already giving the field some credibility? Like, do these guys think this way, that like you're wanting theists to be moved by what you're saying, and you're devoting an entire channel, and you've got 5,000 subscribers who tune in because they want to hear you talk about theism. You're giving it credibility. So notice that when you talk about these things as though they're ridiculous, why do you have this channel if it's so ridiculous? If it's so ridiculous, then why not just drop it? Why does it require a response? I don't make response videos to flat earthers. Why? Because I think flat earthism is silly. So I don't make response videos, right? So what's going on here? But it's, again, I'll tell you what's going on. He does take it seriously. He has to, because he knows people who are theists. People close to him are theists. He knows that there are more theists by far than there are atheists. It's obviously a powerful subcategory of persons, right? So he's got to deal with it, but the way he deals with it is to laugh at it. The way he deals with it is to mock it and that sort of thing. But this guy, as opposed to the Godless Engineer, does it in more of a subtly condescending way, appealing to a different kind of person, appealing to a different sort of viewer. So let's continue.
I'd like to express that I think we can actually go further than the God of merely the philosopher's God.
Whoa. Okay. I caught this the first time I listened to this. He admits here that the God he's describing right now is not that hot. It's not all that. But he admits here, Braxton admits here, that this God that he's describing he uses, what does he say? Merely philosophical. Listen to this. Merely the philosopher's God. So basically, the arguments he's made so far is an argument for a merely philosophical type deity. I'm glad, Braxton, that you admitted that. Okay, now let's get to the...
Wait a minute. You're glad that I admitted that. Listen, I wish I had it. I don't think I have it readily available, but there is a fantastic book from Zondervan's Counterpoint series called 5 Views on Apologetics. It walks through the 5 major divisions of methodologies that Christian apologists use. In fact, I would think everyone running a YouTube atheist channel should be aware of this book and read this book. It's a very well-known book. And the 5 groups are classical apologetics, evidential apologetics, cumulative case, presuppositional, and reformed epistemology. Now, I know that Doug has to be familiar that there are at least 2 of these because he's aware of presuppositionalists like Cy Ten Bruggencate, who he's had on his show. And he's aware that there are people who are not presuppositionalists, like William Lane Craig and myself, and Mike Licona. Let me help you out. Classical apologist would be someone like William Lane Craig. Evidentialist would be someone like Gary Habermas or Mike Licona. Cumulative case would be someone like Douglas Groothaus or Donald J. Johnson. Presuppositionalist would be someone like Cy Ten Bruggencate. So you see there are clear differences in how we approach this. What is the distinguishing feature between classical apologetics and evidential apologetics? Evidential apologists focus purely on the resurrection. They feel like if they give you the resurrection, they've given you the Christian God. People like me and William Lane Craig and Norman Geisler and J.P. Moreland and a host of others, we argue first that God exists, and yes, a philosopher's God. A God. The arguments we use there could be used by a number of different religions. Now, Muslims couldn't use my free will argument because they disavow libertarian freedom, but still, the typical theistic arguments could be used by a number of other monotheistic religions. Why do I give you merely the philosopher's God at first? Admittedly so. When I teach this, I teach it this way. When I talk with atheists, I tell them this is what I'm doing. It's because I want to show you that a God exists, so that then I can follow that with the resurrection to put a name tag on that God. But I also use the argument, as I said previously in this very video, the reason I begin with God's existence is so that we have a sufficient power to do something like a resurrection. It's the whole case that gives you the Christian God. Of course, I'm merely arguing for theism when I use the free will and the Kalam argument. And if I were to use the moral argument or the design argument, that's what we're doing. I'm not admitting anything. This is what we do. And I would think someone who runs a channel like this would be aware of that. So that's a comment that I think needs to be made there, because I keep getting that. Matt said that in the debate. He's like, a couple of these arguments aren't even specific to the Christian God. Right. That's why I brought the resurrection case. Then why did you need the theistic God? So that there was a sufficient power to raise Jesus from the dead. I get it in the YouTube comments all the time. These free will and this Kalam, that doesn't give you the Christian God. Right. It gives you God. Do you understand how these two pieces work together? I think that we would move a lot further down the road in terms of these discussions if people would pick up on this.
That you believe in. But Matt really didn't even, from a debate point of view, he
Listen
didn't
to this.
address every single thing that Braxton Hunter talked about.
Okay, what Doug has just said is really interesting and really important, because it agrees with what I've been saying since the debate, which is Matt didn't really deal with everything that Braxton said. All right?
And I don't think he needed to. I think he kind of did what I'm doing right now, and the more big picture, broad stuff, because that's what really changes people's minds, I think.
Okay, now notice what he's just said, and this is the end of our video, but notice what he's just said. He said he's granting that Matt didn't really deal intricately with the stuff that I brought. Instead, he talked about big picture stuff, because that's the stuff that really changes people's mind. That's what Doug, focus on. It's the stuff that changes people's mind, the big picture stuff. Now, in one sense, I like this. I like that, number one, he's saying this so that you hear it. And I like it from the position of someone who, in a similar way, wants to persuade people. I want to persuade people that Christianity is true. I make no bones about it. I am a loudmouth, leather-lunged, red-faced evangelist. I want people to get saved. I want people to meet Jesus and know Jesus, because I think Christianity represents the truth about the nature of reality. He wants to convince people that they shouldn't be Christians by instilling doubt in them. Okay, that's great. So from a persuasive point, yes, rhetoric is important. Big picture stuff is important. But what I want you to hear that has just been said is that Matt focused on the big picture stuff. So what is that big picture stuff? If he didn't deal in detail with my arguments, what were those big picture things that he focused on? Well, for at least half of his opening statements, he focused on his own deconversion testimony, which gave you no real reason not to be a Christian, just his story of leaving the faith. So if there's anything there that's big picture that Doug is talking about, it's rhetoric, it's emotion, it's focusing not on the evidence. And then when Matt did talk about the evidence, what did he bring? He brought the divine hiddenness charge, and he brought the inconsistent revelation thing. But he didn't deal with my responses to those to any great measure. All he said about the divine hiddenness thing is, yeah, okay. What did he say? He said I said, well, yeah, the reason that we don't believe God shows up on the White House lawn like every couple of years to give a press conference is because God isn't just looking for intellectual belief. Obviously, intellectual belief is part of it, but what he wants is for people to enter into a relationship of trust with him, right? That's what God wants. So if God knows that for Matt or any number of people that they won't enter into a relationship of trust, then the whole thing rings hollow, because Matt admits that even if Christianity were true, he would not worship that God. So why? So this whole thing, what's this business about divine hiddenness? Matt's response was, well, at least we could get beyond this issue about whether or not God exists. But that's the whole thing. We don't just want you to believe God exists. God doesn't just want you to believe that he exists. The demons believe that God exists. God wants you to enter into a relationship with him, right? So the big picture stuff has to be Matt's personal testimony and his brushing off of the Kalam argument saying that it's not really an argument for God, and his brushing off of the free will argument, saying, well, I don't believe in libertarian freedom, and I don't believe in God, so this doesn't convince me. Well, guess what? I like what Mike Winger recently said. My job isn't to convince you. My job is to present a reasonable case. Your job is to be convinced by reasonable cases. So the big picture stuff is really just rhetoric and emotional attempts to instill doubt. Now, I'm not trying to be uncharitable. I'm trying to take what Doug is here saying. And it's a great bookend to this whole discussion, because what started as a charge that I was so religious, we've now seen are two YouTubers who said a few things related to the evidence that were somewhat easy to respond to, but most of it was rhetoric, emotion, mockery, that sort of thing. And you know what? For a lot of people, Doug's right. That is very persuasive, but it shouldn't be. What we should be interested in is the evidence. And so I hope this video has been helpful to you. I do like Doug. I listen to his channel quite frequently, especially when he has debaters on and stuff. And I appreciate about Godless Engineer that he took the time to respond to me. It's nice. It really, I mean, it's meaningful to me anytime someone devotes an entire episode of their show to me. That's, does it stroke my ego? Maybe, but I just appreciate that someone does that. And but in the end, these are things that are easy to respond to. So for those of you that are parents, ministry leaders, people like that out there, number one, be aware that this is out there, that YouTube atheists are approaching this from a number of different perspectives and trying to appeal to a number of different types of people, whether that's intentional or not. Secondly, what they're going to get here is usually the fringe of scholarship. I'm sorry, but when we talk about Godless Engineer, if he's saying Jesus never existed, that is the fringe of scholarship. There are very few, like a handful of scholars, but that is all over YouTube, and that's what young people are going to hear. Where we want to get our information, it's okay to watch this stuff, obviously, but where we really want to get our information is from good, solid academic sources, places where we know that we can look at the citations, we can look at the journal articles, we can listen to people on both sides of this, debate it in a sensible way, and debate the evidence, not debate your psychology, not just throw mockery out there, but debate these issues in a clear and effective way. That's how I learned, and I think that's how the most reasonable atheists get to the positions they're in, is to look at the evidence, look at what's being said, and deal specifically with that. And so I appreciate you watching the video, and I hope to see you soon on Trinity Radio.